And as architects, I also ask this. Of course, it's a bit vague for us, and thank you so much for sort of putting up with our vagueness. But we also ask because as architects, we often look at filmmaking for how things are seen just because of the amount of difference that cameras can capture,
Yeah.
as opposed to the eye, because we formalize that difference in terms of orthographic projections, images, video. We constantly want another way of seeing the same thing. And now we are even going into things we already are all over the place in terms of satellite imagery, in terms of virtual reality. And these are all different modes of seeing the same thing just to see whether there is something else to be discovered or re-originated through an existing architecture, so that we don't have the burden of constantly looking or trying to understand what can be new based on what can be seen in a drawing only,
Yeah.
or everything that does this, and this is old. Because there is a certain amount of faith almost in saying that maybe a different way of seeing an existing architecture or an existing set of drawings would produce a way of understanding what may be different and new about what we could do in the future. And that's basically why we ask these questions, because as filmmakers often do, no matter how many drawings have been made about a certain building, they often find ways to show it to us in a new way. And in
You're
that
being very
sense,
generous. Yeah, that's
yes,
great.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And for example, Chirag and I are absolutely crazy about Wes Anderson and his we
Yeah.
call it frontalism. That should actually be so architectural, not in the sense of his aesthetic and his stylizing, but in the sense that something so frontal, his camera movements or even still shots are so frontal and symmetrical and ordered in a certain way, but the architecture often ends up completely in the background, no matter how stylized it is.
Yeah.
Something that is completely defies all logic that I've ever understood about architecture being in the background. No matter how much you try to send it to the background, it shows up as a strange corner or a dark corner or a light effect that you don't want or want, and it always imposes on either the characters. And good filmmakers often use those aspects of architecture to their benefit. Or but this is what also surprises us about what you do as filmmakers, that there is this constant churning of the background. And in that sense, how do you see the references that you use?
That's a very interesting observation and question. Um, and I'm going to give a longish answer.
Sure.
Sure. Go ahead.
Because architecture and also working a lot with visual artists and painters.
Mm-hmm.
And we recently did a film on our artist friend Kaushik Mukhopadhyay, who
Yes.
also
Yeah.
Squeeze
is
lime in
recently
your eye.
retired.
Yeah.
Yeah, recently retired from Kamala Raheja and has joined C in Mumbai.
Ah.
Mm.
And so him, and before that film, a film on Nilima Sheikh and her
Mhm.
work on Kashmir, or the Garden of Forgotten Snow.
Mhm.
Both two very different modes of visual art. One is Kaushik with his broken household objects repurposed into these strange creatures or machines or toys that he
Yeah.
makes in the form of might be called installation, for his
Mhm.
own
Mhm.
thing. To Dilema, who's completely a painter. you know,
Hmm.
Mm.
and she respects and loves that medium of painting and does her own very specific uh, things with painting. And the act of filming those two or people working in other visual arts um, would be so different, would really be so different. And how do you really make it cinematic? How do you make it experiential? How do you make your viewers kind of engage with and relate to what that work is doing? Sometimes, and like you rightly said, that the lens sees things that you may miss out otherwise in person. And
Mhm.
it's very true because when you're shooting a painting, the kind of detail that you go into, the duration for which you hold it on screen, um, you look at the work very differently than you would
Hmm.
in person, where you're looking at one large painting, where Nilima does these large 10-foot vertical scrolls. So, and if there's 10 of those in a gallery, then, there's only so much detail that you can look at each time that you visit it. You can
Mhm.
look at it again and again.
Yeah.
But when it's projected for you on a large screen or even a small screen, the very fact that a camera has looked at it and shown you things becomes different and a specific experience. Likewise for Kaushik's work, these objects that have their own quirky behavior, their movement, they keep breaking down, they make a noise, and they're kinetic or they're not. And how does the camera really capture that? Becomes a challenge.
Hmm.
And coming back to architecture, like I said, the way you'd respond to a location is using the parameters that I mentioned before.
Mhm.
You know, how am I lensing it? What is the light that we're using? What is the color palette? And so on. But what becomes interesting is when you're doing that on a fiction set where you are actually building those spaces.
Yeah.
You're building those spaces where you are essentially shooting with three walls,
Hmm.
and the fourth wall is the camera. You know,
Mhm.
so how do you really move those uh, spaces? How do you move those walls and furniture and objects of art on the wall around
Hmm.
to make a frame and to create a sense of space for your characters to inhabit? Um, and it's a very well known and common practice that depending on the lens you're using, you'll alter the walls or you'll alter the size of the walls or the size of the props. Or to make a person feel claustrophobic, you'll move the walls closer. Or to whiten it out, you'd move them apart and change the background and so
Ah.
on.
Yeah.
So you alter that experience of space altogether by doing that in conjunction with your tools of lensing and cameras and lighting
Mhm.
and so on. You'd actually alter the architecture itself to do that. You know, very simple, very very simple example is where you are. It's just me against a wall, and you can see the objects behind me in focus. But if you change lenses
Hmm.
and the objects then go out of focus, you are closer to me, but the objects go out of focus, but you want them to be in focus. What would you do? you know
Hmm.
you'd replace that or you'd bring it closer, you know
Mhm.
Yeah.
something as simple as that. So and that becomes fun, for the production designer, for the filmmaker, and the entire team, including the camera person, to be able to play with your medium
Mhm.
and
Hmm.
tease your medium and trick the medium
Yeah.
into doing things, yeah, to actually alter reality. So that example you gave of Wes Anderson is, of course, a
Hmm.
very, very pertinent one, in the way in which he uses space. Um,
Because we
yeah,
also sense that as a filmmaker, um, your the discipline has a much better grasp of human sort of a temporal experience. Let's say, whenever architects design a space, they always want to say the words, in this space you're going to feel like this. And rightly so. I mean, there are spaces we do want to deal with experience in that sense, but we always tend to think that filmmakers have better, maybe this is the therapy part, then have a very good understanding of the temporal experience. What do you think within just from your interaction with architects, what do you think, or how do architects think about it differently, or what ends up in architecture based on how architects think about it?
Well, you are being a little romantic, right, about filmmaking in general.